Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the stream. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we're going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose and riddles stream. So, starting with the poetry, last week we ended on the Indian Serenade, so I'll start by reading it once more. I arise from the dreams of thee, in the first sweet sleep of night, when the winds are breathing low and the stars are shining bright. I rise from dreams of thee, and a spirit in my feet have led me, who knows how, to thy chamber windows sweet. The wandering airs they faint, on the dark the silent stream, and the champak's odours fail, like sweet thoughts in a dream. The nightingale's complaint, it dies upon her heart, as I must on thine, O beloved as thou art. O lift me from the grass, I die, I faint, I fail. Let thy loving kisses rain, and on my lips and eyelids pale. My cheek is cold and white, alas, my heart beats loud and fast. Oh, press it to thine own again, where it will break at last. That was of course by Percy Shelley, as are the poems we've been looking at these last few weeks in this anthology. So, let's move on to 2 also by Percy Shelley. I fear thy kisses, gentle maiden, thou needest not fear mine. My spirit is too deeply laden, ever to burthen thine. I fear thy mien, thy tone, thy motion, thou needest not fear mine. Innocent is the heart's devotion, with which I worship thine. Interesting little short poem there. Alternating A-B rhyming. Very universal theme, I would suggest. It seems that it's about unrequited love. Although perhaps it needn't be unrequited. What else do we have? Looks like... yeah, it looks like iambic tetrameter, but we do have some variations. Ever to burthen thine appears to only contain 3 feet. Oh wait. I take it back, it's of a ballad form, isn't it? It's alternating tetrameter and trimeter. Yep, so it's a ballad. A very short ballad. Yeah, nice little short poem. So I'll read it once more and we'll move on. I fear thy kisses, gentle maiden, thou needest not fear mine. My spirit is too deeply laden, ever to burthen thine. I fear thy mien, thy tones, thy motion, thou needest not fear mine. Innocent is the heart's devotion, with which I worship thine. So next we have tonight. Given that it's 2 words, not 1, I assume this is a poem addressed to the night, as opposed to being about this evening. Swiftly walk over the western waves, spirit of night, out of the misty eastern cave where all the long and lone daylight thou wovest dream of joy and fear which make thee terrible and dear. Swift be thy flight. Wrapping thy form in a mantle grey, star inwrought, blind with thine hair the eyes of day, kiss her until she be wearied out. Then wander o'er city and sea and land, touching all with thine opiate wand. Come, long sought. When I rose and saw the dawn, I sighed for thee. When light rode high and dew was gone, and noon lay heavy on flowers and tree, and the weary day turned to his rest, lingering like an unloved guest, I sighed for thee. Thy brother Death came and cried, wouldest thou me? Thy sweet child Sleep, the filmy-eyed, murmured like a noontide bee, shall I nestle near thy side? Wouldest thou me? And I replied, no, not thee. Death will come when thou art dead, soon, too soon. Sleep will come when thou art fled, or neither would I ask the boon I ask of thee, beloved night. Swift be thine approaching flight, come soon, soon. So this one seems to be a little more complex. Again, I think it is iambic. It seems to be following a regular form, but I don't recognise it. Because the second and seventh verses all seem to contain only 2 feet. At most, come long sought is in fact only 3 syllables. Which actually makes it more like a trochee with a weak ending. Sorry, with a strong ending, with the final syllable docked. Yeah, interesting. When light rode high and the dew was gone. This may be my ignorance, but it seems to me that and the both want to be weak. But that doesn't really fit well with any meter. Because it leaves us with an odd number of syllables. But again, it has this tendency like it wants to be iambic, I'd suggest. So I don't know what the rhythmic structure is, although there clearly is a structure because it's fairly regular. Each stanza seems to have roughly the same pattern of syllables. So let's read it again and consider the meaning. Swiftly walk over the western wave, spirit of night, out of the misty eastern cave where all the long and lone daylight, thou wovest dreams of joy and fear, which make thee terrible and dear. Swift be thy flight. Wrap thy form in a mantle grey, star enwrought. Blind with thine hair the eyes of day, kiss her until she be wearied out. Then wander o'er city and sea and land, touching all with thine opiate wand. Come, long sought. When I arose and saw the dawn, I sighed for thee. When light rode high and the dew was gone, and noon lay heavy on flowers and tree, and the weary day turned to his rest, lingering like an unloved guest, I sighed for thee. Thy brother Death came and cried, wouldest thou me? Thy sweet child Sleep, the filmy-eyed, murmured like a noontide bee, shall I nestle near thy side? Wouldest thou me? And I replied, no, not thee. Death will come when thou art dead, soon, too soon. Sleep will come when thou art fled. Of neither would I ask the boon. I ask of thee, beloved night, swift be thine approaching flight, come soon, come soon. So it sounds as though the meaning of the poem is essentially craving night for sleep, but not wishing to settle for sleep during the day or death. I do wonder if this could be connected to the depression that Shelley experienced following the death of his daughter. I can imagine him longing for sleep during that period, and the days seeming to drag on. But that's just my supposition. Could be wrong. Anyway, that was Tonight. Next we move on to a poet we haven't seen before, James Shirley. So, let's learn a little about him, shall we? James Shirley, 1596 to 1666. Okay, he was quite a bit earlier then. I believe he would have been a young man around the end of Shakespeare's time. No, am I going mad? I am going mad, aren't I? No, I think that's right. Yes, that would be right. And he would have died during the Protectorate, I think. When was the end of the Protectorate? No, he lived just past it. Okay, so he would have been a young man towards the very end of Shakespeare's time, and he would have died just after the Restoration. So he would have actually seen quite a lot of important British history. Living during interesting times, as they say. Anyway, he belonged to the great period of English dramatic literature, but in Charles Lamb's words, he claims a place among the worthies of this period, not so much for any transcendent genius in himself, as that he was the last of a great race, all of whom spoke nearly the same language and had a set of moral feelings and notions in common. His career of playwriting extended from 1625 to the suppression of stage plays by Parliament in 1642. Well, I know they suppressed plays during the Protectorate period. Okay. But the Commonwealth was earlier. Okay. Understood. So in which case he was probably following on the same tradition as Shakespeare was, but his career was prematurely ended when the parliamentarians won the Civil War and banned stage plays, as was consistent with their religious beliefs at the time. So, Shirley was born in London and was descended from the Shirleys of Warwick, the oldest knighted family in Warwickshire. He was educated at Merchant Taylor's School, London, St John's College, Oxford, and St Catherine's College, Cambridge, where he took his BA degree in or before 1618. Interesting. His first poem, Echo, or The Unfortunate Lovers, was published in 1618. No copy of it is known, but it is probably the same as 1646's Narcissus. Oxford biographer Anthony Wood reports that after earning his MA, Shirley became a minister of God's words in or near St Albans. He then left this post apparently due to a conversion to the Roman Catholic faith and was master of St Albans School from 1623 to 1625. His first play, Love Trick, seems to have been written while he was teaching at St Albans. Albans. Okay, that is quite remarkable for the time. Yes, I can imagine being Catholic would not have gone down well during the Commonwealth period. Yes, as my memory serves from history we've looked up while looking at other poetry, I seem to remember that Catholicism was really quite heavily attacked during that period. Playwright in London. In 1625 he returned to London, living in Gray's Inn. In the following 18 years he wrote more than 30 regular plays, tragedies, comedies and tragicomedies. Most of his plays were performed by Queen Henrietta's Men, the playing company for which Shelley served as a house dramatist, much as William Shakespeare had for the King's Men. Shelley's sympathies were with the king in his disputes with Parliament. Yeah, that won't have gone well. And he received marks of special favour from the Queen. Oh, that must be the Queen Consort. He made a bitter attack on William Prynne, who had attacked the stage in Histriomastics, and in 1634 he supplied the text of the Triumph of Peace, a masque presented at Whitehall by the gentlemen of the Inns of Court as a practical reply to Prynne. Dublin and returned to London. Between 1636 and 1640 Shelley went to Ireland, apparently under the patronage of the Earl of Kildare, which I'm probably... Oh, it's probably Kildare, isn't it? I was just about to say I'm probably mispronouncing it horribly. I'm going to suggest it's Kildare, though I don't know. Apparently under the patronage of the Earl of Kildare. 3 or 4 of his plays were produced by his friend John Ogleby in Dublin's Werber Street Theatre, which again I must be mispronouncing, I'm sure. The first ever built in Ireland, and at the time of Shelley's visit only 1 year old. During his Dublin stay, Shelley wrote The Doubtful Heir, The Royal Master, The Constant Maid, and St. Patrick for Ireland. In 1640 he returned to London and found that in his absence Queen Henrietta's Men had sold off a dozen of his plays to the stationers, who published them in the late 1630s. As a result, he would no longer work for the Queen Henrietta's Company, and the final plays of his London career were acted by the King's Men. Theatre closure and civil war. In 1642 his career as a playwright was stopped by the London theatre closure. On the outbreak of the English Civil War, Shelley seems to have served with the Earl of Newcastle, but when the king's fortunes began to decline, he returned to London. He owed something to the kindness of Thomas Stanley, but supported himself chiefly by teaching and publishing some educational works under the Commonwealth. Besides these, he published, during the Commonwealth period, 4 small volumes of poems and plays. In 1646, 1653, 1655 and 1659 he was a drudge for John Ogleby in his translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I'm not familiar with that term. A person who works in a low servile job. Derogatory, someone who works for and may be taken advantage of by someone else. Oh. Late life and death. He survived into the reign of Charles II, but did not again attempt to write for the stage, though some of his comedies were revived. Waterset Shirley, aged 70, and his second wife died of fright and exposure after the Great Fire of London, and were buried at St Giles in the Fields on the 29th of October 1666. Oh dear. So it sounds like their home must have been burnt down and then they died of exposure afterwards. That is very sad. Anyway. So that's who he was. And this is a song from Ajax and Ulysses. Ulysses being the Romanized form of Odysseus, if I recall correctly. The glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armour against fate. Death lays his icy hand on kings. Sceptre and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor crooked scythe and spade. Some men with swords may reap the field, and plant fresh laurels where they kill, but their strong nerves at last must yield. They tame but one another still. early or late they stoop to fate, and must give up for their murmuring breath, when they, pale captives, creep to death. The garlands wither on your brow, then boast no more your mighty deeds. Upon death's purple altar now, see where the victor victim bleeds. Your heads must come to the cold tomb, only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust. Interesting. Interesting that it seems to mostly be in iambic tetrameter. Because of course, Shakespeare, who we would naturally draw a comparison to, wrote almost exclusively in iambic pentameter, as far as I'm aware. But this is most certainly tetrameter. Aside from the odd lines of, would that be bimeter? No, what do they call it if it's, two? Mono is presumably 1, and trimeter is 3. Diameter. Okay. Diameter. This is obviously spelt the American way. So yeah. But I suppose that makes sense, because if you have 2 lines of diameter, that's going to be equivalent to 1 line of tetrameter. When I say equivalent, that doesn't mean there might not be more of a pause inserted than there otherwise would be. And by the looks of it, it has relevance to the rhyming structure. But it would probably still sound like a tetrameter. As for the rhyming scheme, it's an interesting A B A B C C D D. And the CC is made by the two lines of 2 feet each. So yeah, interesting structure. I like it. Fairly simple, but at the same time, fairly simple and fairly nice sounding, but at the same time more unique than most we see. At least as far as I'm aware. I can only go by what we've read in this anthology. Perhaps this is an incredibly common form that I just don't know the name of. So, as for meaning, let's have another reading. The glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armour against fate, death lays icy hand on kings. Sceptre and crown must tumble down, in the dust be equal made with the poor crooked scythe and spade. Some men with swords may reap the field, and plant fresh laurels where they kill, but their strong nerves at last must yield, they tame but one another still. Early or late, they stoop to fate and must give up their murmuring breath when they pale captives creep to death. The garlands wither on your brow, then boast no more your mighty deeds. Upon death's purple altar now, see where the victim bleeds. Your heads must come to the cold tomb. Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust. So it seems to be a reflection on the nature of death, the fact that it's inevitable, unavoidable, and the very last pair of verses, seem to indicate that the only exception is that the actions of the just may survive death. Which is interesting. Quite well-worn sentiments, I should think, but well rendered. Anyway, so that was Song from Ajax and Ulysses by James Shirley. Next we have Robert Southey. Now, I've definitely heard of him before. I'm trying to remember who he's contemporaneous with. Was he one of the lake poets during the same time as Shelley and Lord Byron? Robert Southey, 1774 to 1843. I always forget when the Victorian era begins, but I think he was born Georgian and would have died Victorian just. 1837, so yes, that is correct. Was an English poet of the Romantic School and poet laureate from 1813 until his death. Like the other lake poets, William Wordsmith and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Southey began as a radical but became steadily more conservative as he gained respect for Britain and its institutions. Other romantics such as Byron accused him of siding with the establishment for money and status. He is remembered especially for the poems After Blenheim and the original version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Oh. So yes, he was in fact one of the lake poets. Where was I? Monarch, George III, George IV, William IV, and Victoria. So, he actually saw quite a few monarchs in his time. When did George III pass on? 1820. Oh goodness, that means that... You'd think I'd know the history better. That means the other ones... No, they didn't have long reigns at all. So he would have been quite old when George III passed on. When was it? January 1820. I don't know how I did that. Never mind. So what? It would have been about... You're doing what? 45, I think? And then within the space of 23 years, he would have seen 3 more monarchs inherit the throne. Yes, I think that's right. Anyway, as to his life. Robert Southey was born in Wine Street, Bristol, to Robert Southey and Margaret Hill. He was educated at Westminster School, London, where he was expelled for writing an article in the Flagellant attributing the invention of flogging to the devil. and at Balliol College, Oxford. Southey later said of Oxford, "All I learnt was a little swimming and a little boating." Experimenting with a writing partnership with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, most notably in their joint composition of The Fall of Robespierre, Southey published his first collection of poems in 1794. The same year, Southey, Coleridge, Robert Lovell, and several others discussed creating an idealistic community, Pantisocracy. On the banks of the Susquehanna River in the United States. In America. In 1799, Southey and Coleridge were involved with an early experiment in 1799, Southey and Coleridge were involved with early experiments with nitrous oxide laughing gas conducted by the Cornish scientist Humphrey Davy. In 1838, Edith died and Southey remarried to Caroline Ann Bowles, also a poet, on the 4th of June 1839. Southey's mind was giving way when he wrote a last letter to his friend Landor in 1839. That's familiar. But he continued to mention Landor's name when generally incapable of mentioning anyone. He died on the 21st of March 1843 and was buried in the churchyard of Croftswaite Church, Keswick, where he had worshipped for 40 years. There is a memorial to him inside the church with an epitaph written by his friend William Wordsworth. Southey was also a prolific letter writer, literary scholar, essay writer, historian and biographer. His biographies include the life and works of John Bunyan, John Wesley, William Cowper, Oliver Cromwell and Horatio Nelson. The last has rarely been out of print since its publication in 1813 and was adapted as the 1926 British film Nelson. Interesting. So that's who he was. And this poem appears to be entitled Stanzas. Although I find that slightly surprising. I wonder if that is its actual title, or as we have seen with a few of the other poems in this anthology, whether it's been misnamed. Anyway, where were we? My days among the dead are past, around me I behold, wherever these casual eyes are cast, the mighty minds of old. My never-failing friends are they, with whom I converse day by day. With them I take delight in weal, and seek relief in woe. And while I understand and feel how much to them I owe, my cheeks have often been bedewed with tears of thoughtful gratitude. My thoughts are with the dead, with them. I live in long past years, their virtues love, their faults condemn, partake their hopes and fears, and from their lessons seek and find instruction with a humble mind. My hopes are with the dead anon, my place with them will be, and with them shall travel on through all futurity. Yet leaving here a name I trust that will not perish in the dust. Quite a lot of this sounded to me like it was of ballad form, although I'm not sure the end of it was. No, I think the final line of each stanza was a tetrameter. Yeah, so it's a variation on the ballad then. We seem to have an A-B-A-B-C-C rhyming scheme. And as for the meaning, I would suggest it's rather describing what we've been doing here. Reading through reading and analysing literature written by people who have long since left this world. Quite beautiful in its way. So, let's give it one final reading and move on. My days among the dead are past, around me I behold, wherever these casual eyes are cast, the mighty minds of old. My never-failing friends are they, with whom I converse day by day. With them I take delight in weal, and seek relief in woe. And while I understand and feel how much to them I owe, my cheeks have often been bedewed with tears of thoughtful gratitude. My thoughts are with the dead, with them I live in long past years. Their virtues love, their faults condemn, partake their hopes and fears, and from their lessons seek and find instruction with a humble mind. My hopes are with the dead anon, my place with them will be, and with them shall travel on through all futurity, yet leaving here a name I trust that will not perish in the dust. Robert Louis Stevenson. He was the writer of Treasure Island, I believe. Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish novelist, essayist, poet and travel writer. He is best known for works such as Treasure Island, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Kidnapped and A Child's Garden of Verses. Interesting. I didn't know he wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Born and educated in Edinburgh, Stevenson suffered from serious bronchial trouble for much of his life, but continued to write prolifically and travel widely in defiance of his poor health. As a young man, he mixed in London literary circles, receiving encouragement from Andrew Lang, Edmund Gosse, Leslie Stephen, and W.E. Henley. That'll be William Henley, I believe. William Ernest Henley, who I believe, who was also a poet. We've read some of his poetry, and also the gentleman on who Robbie Louis Stevenson supposedly based Captain Hook, if I recall correctly. The last of whom may have provided the model for Long John Silver. Long John Silver, I do apologise. Captain Hook was Peter Pan, wasn't it? Ignore me. Long John Silver in Treasure Island. In 1819, he settled in Samoa, where, alarmed at increasing European and American influence in the South Sea Islands, his writing turned away from romance and adventure fiction towards a darker realism. He died in his island home in 1894, at age 44. Yeah, he was firmly Victorian and died quite young. What a time to be born. If he hadn't died so tragically young, he could easily have witnessed the First World War as well. Clearly not serving. But what change he would have seen in the world. Anyway, a celebrity in his lifetime, Stevenson's critical reputation has fluctuated since his death, though today his works are held in general acclaim. In 2018, he was ranked just behind Charles Dickens as the 26th most translated author in the world. Usually I would read through all this, but there is quite a lot of it, and it appears to only have a single short poem, so we'll skip that, I think. We have some idea who he was already. Requiem. Requiem. What does that mean? That's got something to do with death, doesn't it? A mass, especially Catholic, to honour and remember a dead person. A musical composition for such a mass. A piece of music composed to honour a dead person. Obsolete, rest or peace. Under the wide and starry sky, did the grave and let me lie. Sorry, let me start again. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. It seems to be mostly iambic tetrameter. In the second line, for example, we do see an exception in that it seems to be a trochaic tetrameter with the final syllable docked to give it a masculine ending, which is interesting. Interesting. So the rhyming scheme seems to be A, 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 B, C, 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 D. Particularly interesting that we've got a rhyming scheme that works across stanzas. As for the meaning, that's a little more complex. I think it's essentially a celebration of a life well lived and work complete. Particularly based on lines such as glad did I live and gladly die, and home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. It gives a sense of I've done what I set out to do, and now I can rest. And death being equated to rest. Interesting short poem. So I'll read it once more and we'll move on. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. What do you mean you grave for me? What does grave mean as a verb? To dig. To carve or cut as letters or figures and some hard substance to engrave. Oh, that makes sense. So, as on a tombstone then. And it corresponds to the grave we see in line 2, which is the noun. So, bringing about much the same imagery. Apparently it can also mean to entomb, to bury. Fair enough. Right, moving on. Lord Tennyson. Goodness, he was a giant of Victorian poetry, wasn't he? As far as I recall. Alfred Tennyson, 1st Baron Tennyson, was an English poet. He was the poet laureate during much of Queen Victoria's reign. Oh, that's right, he wrote Charge of the Light Brigade, I think. In 1829, Tennyson was awarded the Chancellor's Gold Medal at Cambridge for one of his first pieces, Timbuktu. He published his first solo collection of poems chiefly lyrical, in 1830, Clarabelle and Mariana, which remain some of Tennyson's most celebrated poems, were included in this volume. Although described by some critics as overly sentimental, his verse soon proved popular and brought Tennyson to the attention of well-known writers of the day, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Tennyson's early poetry, with its medievalist and powerful visual imagery, was a major influence in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I vaguely remember hearing about them. It was a group of English painters, poets and art critics founded in 1848 by William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Michael Rossetti, James Yeah, who were they again? What were they about? The Brotherhood was only ever a loose association, and the principle was shared by other artists of the time, including The group sought to return to the abundant detail, intense colour, and complex compositions of Quattrocento Italian art. They rejected what they regarded as the mechanistic approach first adopted by the Mannerist artists who succeeded Raphael and Michelangelo. So that's who they were. So, Tennyson's early poetry, with its medievalist and powerful visual imagery, was a major influence in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Tennyson also excelled at short lyrics such as Break, 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 The Charge of the Light Brigade, Tears, Idle Tears, and Crossing the Bar. Much of his verse was based on classical mythological themes such as Ulysses. In Memoriam AHH was written to commemorate his friend Arthur Hallam, a fellow poet and student at Trinity College at Cambridge, after he died of a stroke at the age of 22. That is sad. Tennyson also wrote some notable blank verse, including Ideals of the King, Ulysses, and Tithonus. During his career, Tennyson attempted drama, but his plays enjoyed little success. A number of phrases from Tennyson's work have become commonplace in the English language, including nature red in tooth and claw, in memoriam AHH, 'tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Oh! I didn't know that was of his coinage. That's interesting. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. My strength is as the strength of 10, because my heart is pure. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers, and the old order changeth, yielding place to new. He is the 9th most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. Tennyson was born on the 6th of August 1809 in Somersby, Lincolnshire, England. He was born into a successful middle-class family of minor landowning status, distantly descended from John Savage, 2nd Earl Rivers, and Francis Leake, 1st Earl of Scarsdale. So he was of a middle-class family then, so presumably he gained his, what was his title? Presumably he became a baron later in life. His father, George Clayton Tennyson, was an Anglican clergyman who served as rector of Somersby, also rector of Bennyworth and Bag Enderby, and vicar of Grimsby. He raised a large family and was a man of superior abilities and varied attainments, who tried his hand with fair success in architecture, painting, music and poetry. He was comfortably well off for a country clergyman, and his shrewd money management enabled the family to spend summers at Mablethorpe and Skegness on the eastern coast of England. George Clayton Tennyson was elder son of attorney and MP George Tennyson, JPDL of Bayonne Manor and Uselby Hall, who had also inherited the estates of his mother's family, the Claytons, and married Mary, daughter and heiress of John Turner of Caistor, Lincolnshire. George Clayton Tennyson was however pushed into a career in the church and passed over as heir in favour of his younger brother, Charles Tennyson d'Eyncourt. Alfred Tennyson's mother, Elizabeth, was the daughter of Stephen Fitz, vicar of St. James' Church, Louth, and rector of Wivecall, a small village between Horncastle and Louth. Tennyson's father carefully attended to the education and training of his children. Tennyson and two of his elder brothers were writing poetry in their teens, and a collection of poems by all three was published locally when Alfred was only 17. One of these brothers, Charles Tennyson Turner, later married Louisa Selwood, the younger sister of Alfred's future wife. The other was Frederick Tennyson, another of Tennyson's brothers. Edward Tennyson was institutionalized at a private asylum. Oh dear. Tennyson was a student of King Edward VI Grammar School, Louth, from 1816 to 1820. He entered Trinity College, Cambridge in 1827, where he joined a secret society called the Cambridge Apostles. A portrait of Tennyson by James Frederick Watts is in Trinity's collection. At Cambridge, Tennyson met Arthur Hallam and William Henry Brookfield, who became his closest friends. His first publication was a collection of his boyish rhymes and those of his elder brother Charles, entitled Poems by Two Brothers, published in 1827. In 1829, Tennyson was awarded the Chancellor's Gold Medal at Cambridge for one of his first pieces, Timbuktu. Reportedly, it was thought to be no slight honour for a young man of 20 to win the Chancellor's Gold Medal. He published his first solo collection of poems chiefly lyrical, in 1830. Claribel and Mariana, which later took their place among Tennyson's most celebrated poems, were included in this volume. Although decried by some critics as overly sentimental, his verse soon proved popular and brought Tennyson to the attention of well-known writers of the day, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Return to Lincolnshire's second publication, Epping Forest. In the spring of 1831, Tennyson's father died, requiring him to leave Cambridge before taking his degree. He returned to the rectory, where he was permitted to live for another 6 years and shared responsibility for his widowed mother and the family. Arthur Hallam came to stay with his family during the summer and became engaged to Tennyson's sister, Amelia Tennyson. In 1833, Tennyson published his second book of poetry, which notably included the first version of The Lady of Shalott. The volume met heavy criticism, which so discouraged Tennyson that he did not publish again for 10 years, although he did continue to write. That same year, Hallam died suddenly and unexpectedly after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage while on a holiday in Vienna. Hallam's death had a profound effect on Tennyson and inspired several poems, including In the Valley of Cauteretz and In Memoriam A.H.H., a long poem detailing the way of the soul. Tennyson and his family were allowed to stay in the rectory for some time, but later moved to Beech Hill Park, High Beech, deep within Epping Forest, Essex, about 1837. Tennyson's son recalled there was a pond in the park on which in winter my father might have been skating, sailing about on the ice in his long blue cloak. He liked the nearness of London, whither he resorted to see his friends, but he could not stay in town even for a night, his mother being in such a nervous state that he did not like to leave her. Tennyson befriended a Dr. Allen, who ran a nearby asylum, whose patients then included the poet John Clare. An unwise investment in Dr. Allen's ecclesiastical woodcarving enterprise soon led to the loss of much of the family fortune, and led to a bout of serious depression. According to Tennyson's grandson, Sir Charles Tennyson, Tennyson met Thomas Carlyle in 1839, if not earlier. The pair began a lifelong friendship and were famous smoking companions. Some of Tennyson's work even bears the influence of Carlyle and his ideas. Tennyson moved to London in 1840 and lived for a time at Chapel House, Twickenham. On 1842, while living modestly in London, Tennyson published the 2-volume poems, of which the first included work already published, and the second was made up almost entirely of new poems. They met with immediate success. Poems from this collection, such as Locksley Hall, Break, 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 and Ulysses, and a new version of The Lady of Shalott, have met enduring fame. The Princess, a medley, a satire on women's education that came in 1847, was also popular for its lyrics. W.S. Gilbert later adapted and parodied the piece twice, in The Princess and in Princess Ida. It was in 1850 that Tennyson reached the pinnacle of his career, finally publishing his masterpiece In Memoriam AHH, dedicated to Hallam. Later the same year he was appointed Poet Laureate, succeeding William Wordsworth. In the same year, on the 13th of June, Tennyson married Emily Selwood, whom he had known since childhood in the village of Shiplake. They had two sons, Hallam Tennyson, named after his friend, and Lionel. Tennyson rented Farringford House on the Isle of Wight in 1853, eventually buying it in 1856. He eventually found that there were too many starstruck tourists who pestered him in Farringford, so he moved to Aldworth in West Sussex in 1869. However, he retained Farringford and regularly returned there to spend the winters. In 1850, after William Wordsworth's death and Samuel Rogers' refusal, Tennyson was appointed to the position of Poet Laureate. Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Leigh Hunt had also been considered. He held the position until his own death in 1892, the longest tenure of any laureate. Tennyson fulfilled the requirements of this position, such as by authoring a poem of greeting to Princess Alexandra of Denmark when she arrived in Britain to marry the future King Edward VII. In 1855, Tennyson produced one of his best-known works, A Charge of the Light Brigade, a dramatic tribute to the British cavalry involved in an ill-advised charge on the 25th of October 1854 during the Crimean War. Other esteemed works written in the post of Poet Laureate include Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington, an ode sung at the opening of the International Exhibition. Tennyson initially declined a baronetcy in 1865 and 1868, when tendered by Disraeli, finally accepting a peerage in 1883 at Gladstone's earnest solicitation. Yes, a baronet is a less senior title than being a baron, which is a type of peerage. In 1884, Victoria created him Baron Tennyson of Aldford in the County of Sussex and of Freshwater in the Isle of Wight. He took his seat in the House of Lords on the 11th of March 1884. Tennyson also wrote a substantial quantity of unofficial political verse, from the bellicose Form, Rifleman, Form, on the French crisis of 1859 and the creation of the volunteer force, to Steersman, Be not precipitate in thine act of steering. Deploring Gladstone's Home Rule Bill, Tennyson's family were Whigs by tradition, and Tennyson's own politics fitted the Whig mould, although he would also vote for the Liberal Party after the Whigs dissolved. Tennyson believed that society should progress through gradual and steady reform, not revolution, and this attitude was reflected in his attitude towards universal suffrage, which he did not outright reject, but recommended only after the masses had been properly educated and adjusted to self-government. Upon passage of the 1832 Reform Act, Tennyson broke into a local church to ring the bells in celebration. Virginia Woolf wrote a play called Freshwater, showing Tennyson as host to his friends Julia Margaret Cameron and J.F. Watt. Colonel George Edward Gouraud, Thomas Edison's European agent, made sound recordings of Tennyson's reading his own poetry late in his life. They include recordings of The Charge of the Light Brigade and excerpts from The Splendor Falls, from The Princess, Come Into the Garden, from Maud, Ask Me No More, Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington, and Lancelot and Elaine. The sound quality is poor, as wax cylinder recordings usually are. Towards the end of his life, Tennyson revealed that his religious beliefs also defied convention, leaning towards agnosticism and pandeism. It held that a greater deity became the universe and ceased to exist as a separate entity. In a characteristically Victorian manner, Tennyson combines a deep interest in contemporary science with an unorthodox, even idiosyncratic Christian belief. Famously, he wrote in memoriam, "There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds." In Maud, 1855, he wrote, "The churches have killed their Christ." In Locksley Hall, 16 years after, Tennyson wrote, "Christian love among the churches looked the twin of heathen hate." In his play Becket, he wrote, "We are all self-uncertain creatures, and we may, yea, even when we know not, mix our spites and private hates with our defence of heaven." Tennyson recorded in his diary, page 127, "I believe in pantheism of a sort." His autobiography claims that Tennyson was an unorthodox Christian, noting that Tennyson praised Giordano Bruno and Spinoza on his deathbed, saying of Bruno, "His view of God is in some ways mine." Anyway, yeah, that'll do for now, I think. That should certainly give us a good idea of who he was. So we'll finish on Song from the Miller's Daughter. It is the miller's daughter, and she is grown so dear, that I would be the jewel that trembles in her ear. For hidden ringlets day and night I touch her neck so warm and white, and I would be the girdle and her dainty waist, about her dainty waist, and her heart would beat against me in sorrow and in rest, and I should know if I beat right. And I should know if it beat right. I'd clasp it round so close and tight, and I would be the necklace, and all day long to fall and rise upon her balmy bosom. With her laughter or her sighs, I would lie so light, I scarce should be unclasped at night. Balmy. Producing balm, soothing or fragrant, of weather mild and pleasant. Looks like an A, B, C, B, D, D rhyming scheme. Roughly. I'm not sure about waste and rest. I see 6-syllable lines, 7-syllable lines, and 8-syllable lines. Which is a little confusing. I think it's broadly iambic. Yes, I think lines like "and I would be the girdle" is just a iambic trimeter that is 3 feet with an additional weak syllable added to the end. So I could be wrong, but I think it's iambic. The The content seems to, broadly speaking, be about love and desire to be close to someone. I noticed that Emily Selwood, who was Lord Tennyson's wife, was not the daughter of a miller, she was the daughter of a lawyer. So, if this is in any way autobiographical, it must be about one would presume, someone he a flame that he had before marriage, probably, though there's a good chance it's not autobiographical at all. So I'll read it once more, and then we will move on to Frankenstein. It is the miller's daughter, and she has grown so dear, that I would be the jewel that trembles in her ear, for hid in ringlets day and night. I touch her neck so warm and white, and I would be the girdle about her dainty, dainty waist, and her heart would beat against me in sorrow and in rest, and I should know if it beat right. I'd clasp it round so close and tight, and I would be the necklace, and all day long to fall and rise upon her balmy bosom, with her laughter or her sighs, and I would lie so light, and scarce should be unclasped at night. So, Frankenstein. Last week we read chapters 5, 6 and 7, I believe. Yes, I believe that's right. So, in chapter 5, Victor succeeds in Let me start again. In chapter 5, Victor succeeds in bestowing life upon his creation, and is revolted. He avoids the creature as much as possible, roving without sleep, until eventually it disappears upon its own accord. In the interim, Henry Clerval had appeared from a carriage. It seems he was to study at Ingolstadt after all. He did not see the creature, but he did witness Victor's resulting nervous breakdown, and elected to nurse him back to health over several months rather than begin his studies promptly. In chapter 6, as Victor is on the verge of complete recovery, he receives a cheery letter from Elizabeth, to which he promptly replies. Upon introducing Henry to the university's professors, Victor finds himself revolted by any reminder of his former study. Victor instead joins Henry in a study of the Persian, Arabic and Sanskrit languages, and slowly finds joy in life once more. In chapter 7, Elizabeth writes to Victor to inform him of William's murder. William was one of Victor's little brothers. Victor travels back home. On the way, he stops by the site of the murder. To both his shock and horror, he encounters a creature there briefly. Victor convinces himself that the creature must have been the murderer, and is left ever more miserable when he learns a family maid whom he regards a great deal, Justine, is on trial for the murder owing to circumstantial evidence. Victor tries to convince his family that Justine is innocent, but the only unqualified positive response comes from Elizabeth, who never believed Justine to be the murderer in the first place. In any case, Justine's fate is already in the hands of the courts. So that's where we left off. Let's continue. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings, one a smiling babe, full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause! 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated. Let's look that up. To clear of or to free from guilt, exonerate. From exculpa, out, fault. Okay. And such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands. To feel loathing for, to abhor, to declare to be hateful or abhorrent, to denounce. Ex meaning out, and sacrare, to consecrate, declare, accused. Execrate. Although gazed on and execrated by thousands, for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited, was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, and as her confusion had before been adduced as proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it, and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eyes when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. The trial began, and, after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely, and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly if anything had been heard concerning him. When showing the body, she fell into violent hysterics and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then produced, which her servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which, an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed round his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defence. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible although variable voice. God knows, she said, how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestation should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favourable interpretation, where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious. She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt at Chenay, which I'm probably mispronouncing, a village situated about a league from Geneva. On her return at about 9 o'clock, she met a man, who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account, and passed several hours in looking for him. When the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call up the inhabitants to whom she was well known. Most of the night she spent here watching. Towards morning she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her and she awoke. It was dawn and she quitted her asylum, that she might again endeavour to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night, and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture she could give no account. I know, continued the unhappy victim, how heavily and fatally this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities which might have been placed in my pocket. The probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket. But here I also am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would be so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for doing so, or if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of my judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not outweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. I think timorous means quiet. Oh, fearful, afraid, or timid. That makes more sense. Elizabeth saw even this last resource. Her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct about to fail the accused, when, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. I am, said she, the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forward on this accusation, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of his pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5, and at another for nearly 2 years. During all that period she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during a tedious illness, in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her, after which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say, that notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action, as the bauble on which the chief proof rests. As to the bauble on which the chief priest rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her, so much do I esteem and value her. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but was excited by her generous interference, and not in favour of poor Justine. Approbation. Is that condemning? The act of approving. Oh, approving. Wrong way round. The act of approving and assenting to the propriety of a thing with some degree of pleasure or satisfaction. Approval, sanction, commendation, or official recognition. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but was excited by her generous interference, and not in favour of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon, who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenance of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forgo their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness in the morning. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to court. My lips and throat were parched. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I have endeavoured to bestow upon them adequate expressions, but words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. That evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case, but I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive. This was strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me? Or was I really as mad as the whole world would believe me to be? If I disclosed the object of my suspicions, I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. My cousin, replied I, it is decided as you may have expected. All judges had rather than 10 innocents should suffer than 1 guilty should escape. But she has confessed. That appears to be a reference to Blackstone's ratio. William Blackstone being a judicial theorist who stated that it would be Sir William Blackstone, I should say, that it would be a greater evil for one innocent person to be imprisoned or to be condemned than for 10 guilty individuals to escape justice. And that is how, at least for a time, the British justice system has been based. That it is that the most important thing is to make sure that innocent people aren't condemned for crimes far more important than for crimes they didn't commit because they're innocent than for a guilty. It's far more important to ensure that than it is to ensure that every guilty person is convicted. So, in other words, you're innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proof has to be quite high to prove guilt in criminal cases, hence beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, all of this is just to say that that's what they're referencing there, because they've reversed it. All judges had rather that 10 innocents should suffer than 1 guilty should escape. But she has confessed. This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. Alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justine, who I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or guile, and yet she has committed a murder. Soon after we heard that the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin, my father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. Yes, said Elizabeth, I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone. The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber, and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the farther end. Her hands were manacled, and her head restrained on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin also wept. Oh, Justine, she said, why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now. And do you also believe that I am very, very wicked? Do you also join with my enemies to crush me, condemn me as a murderer? Her voice was suffocated with sobs. Rise, my poor girl, said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed your guilt was notwithstanding every evidence until I heard that you yourself had declared your guilt. That report, you say, is false. And be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment but your own confession. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced, until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication, hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. And now only am I truly miserable. She paused, weeping, and then continued, I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honoured, and whom you loved, was a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we shall all be happy, and that consoles me, going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, dear girl. Do not fear. I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies by my tears and prayers. You shall not die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my sister, perish on the scaffold. No, no! I never could survive so horrible a misfortune. Justine shook her head mournfully. I do now not fear to die, she said. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave a sad and bitter world, and if you remember me and think of me as one unjustly condemned, I am resigned to the fate awaiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Despair! Who dared talk of that? The poor victim, who on the morrow was to pass the awful boundary between life and death, felt not as I did, such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul. Justine started when she saw who it was. She approached me and said, Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty. I could not answer. No, Justine, said Elizabeth. He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it. I truly thank him. In these last moments I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am. It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace, now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin. Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others than herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers also was the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, for a while hides but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. I wish, cried she, that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery. Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth and said, in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven, in its bounty, bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so. And on the morrow Justine died. Elizabeth's heart-ending eloquence failed to move the judges from their settled conviction in the criminality of the saintly sufferer. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost upon them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh unfeeling reasoning of these men, my purposed avowal died away on my lips. Thus I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence passed upon my wretched victim. She perished on the scaffold as a murderess. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. She was also my doing, and my father's woe in the desolation of that late so smiling home. All was the work of my thrice-accused hands. You weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentation shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early much-loved friend, he who should spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who has no thought nor sense of joy except as it is mirrored also in your dear countenances, who would fill the air with blessings and spend his life in serving you, he bids you weep, to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes. If thus inexorable fate be satisfied, and if the destruction paused before the peace of grave have succeeded to your sad torments, thus spoke my pathetic soul, as, torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. Quite terrible, isn't it? Chapter 9. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than, after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows, and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed to my heart which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness, and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice, and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience, which allowed me to look upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures, such as no language can describe. This state of mind preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock it had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sound of joy or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation, deep, dark, death-like solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavoured by arguments deduced from the feelings of his serene conscience and guiltless life, to inspire me with fortitude and awaken me in the courage to dispel the dark cloud which brooded over me. "Do you think, Victor," said he, "that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother." Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But it is not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief. It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inapplicable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends, if remorse had not mingled its bitterness, and terror its alarm, with my other sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair, and endeavour to hide myself from his view. About this time we retired to a house at Belrive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock, and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour, had rendered our residence within the walls of Geneva very irksome to me. I was now free. Often after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes with my sails set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes, after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course, and gave way to my own miserable reflections. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in a scene so beautiful and heavenly, if I except some bat or the frogs, whose harsh and interrupted croaking was heard only when I approached the shore. Often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever, but I was restrained, when thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved, and whose existence was bound up in mine. I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had let loose among them? At these moments I wept bitterly, and wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I might afford them consolation and happiness, but that could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope, and I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should perpetrate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that all was not over, and that he would still commit some signal crime, which by its enormity should almost efface the recollections of the past. There was always scope for fear, so long as anything I loved remained behind. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when there have precipitated him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of abhorrence on his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Oh, I see. That took me a moment. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when there, have precipitated him to their base. I think it means push him off the mountain. Our house was a house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All the pleasure seemed to her sacrilege towards the dead. Eternal woe and tears she then thought was just a tribute she should pay to innocence so blasted and destroyed. She was no longer that happy creature who in earlier youth wandered with me on the banks of the lake and talked with ecstasy of our future prospects. The first of those sorrows which are sent to wean us from the earth had visited her, and its dimming influence quenching her dearest smiles. When I reflect, my dear cousin, said she, on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered, assuredly she would have been the most depraved of human creatures. For the sake of a few jewels, to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she had nursed from its birth, and appeared to love as if it had been her own, I could not consent to the death of any human being, but I certainly should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. But she was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent. You are of the same opinion, that confirms me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, towards which thousands are crowding, and endeavouring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free and perhaps respected. But even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not indeed, but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me. God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge in your countenance that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you, who centre all their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Ah, while we love, while we are true to each other, here in the land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing. What could disturb our peace? And could not such words from her whom I fondly prized before every other gift of fortune suffice to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart? Even as she spoke, I drew near to her, as if in terror, lest at the very moment the destroyer had been near to rob me of her. Thus not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of earth, nor of heaven, could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer, dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, where to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and to die, was but a type of me. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek, by bodily exercise and by change of place, some relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an excess of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps towards the near alpine valleys, sought in my magnificence the eternity of such scenes, to forget myself and my ephemeral, because human sorrows... Sorry, I'm going to say that. I'm going to go back a bit. It was during an access of this kind... I'm going to go back further. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek, by bodily exercise and by change of place, some relief from my intolerable sensations. Okay, so he's out exercising. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps towards the near alpine valleys, sought in the magnificence the eternity of such scenes, to forget myself and my ephemeral, because human sorrows... Okay, I get it. His sorrows are ephemeral because he is human and all humans die. My wanderings were directed towards the valley of Chamonix, which I must be mispronouncing. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed since then. I was a wreck, but not a change in those savage and enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. I afterwards hired a mule as the more sure-footed and least liable to receive injury on those rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was about the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine, that miserable epoch from which I dated all my woe. The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper in the ravine of Arve. The immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence. And I ceased to fear or to bend before any less almighty than that which created and ruled the elements, here displayed in their most terrific guise. Still, as I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of pinning mountains. Pinning? Or pertaining to or having many pines. Oh, piney. That makes more sense. Ruined castles hanging on the Let me try again. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of piney mountains. The impetuous Arve, and cottages every here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty, but it was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of beings. I passed the bridge of Pelissier, which I am sure I'm also mispronouncing, where the ravine which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountains that overhangs it. Soon after I entered the valley of Chamonix, which is probably the wrong pronunciation anyway. This valley is more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful and picturesque as that of Cerveau, or Cervox, I don't know, through which I had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche, and marked the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding Argyles. Aiguilles. Again, I don't know how to pronounce it. And its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. A tingling long way. And its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. Again, that's got an accent, but I'm wondering if that means dome in the English sense, or if that's just a completely different word. Oh, it is a dome. Fair enough. So I guess it's a dome-shaped mountain then. A tingling, long-lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognised reminded me of days gone by and were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me weep no more. Then again, the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief, and indulging in all the misery of reflection. Then I spurred on my animal, striving so as to forget the world, my fears, and more than all, myself, or in a more desperate fashion I alighted, and threw myself on the grass, weighted down by horror and despair. At length I arrived at the village of Chamonix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue both of body and of mind which I had endured. For a short space of time I remained at the window, watching the pallid lightings that played above Mont Blanc, and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which pursued its noisy way beneath. The same lulling sounds acted as a lullaby to my too keen sensations. When I placed my head upon my pillow, sleep crept over me. I felt it as it came, and blessed the giver of oblivion. Chapter 10. I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside the sources of the Arveiron, which take their rise in a glacier that with slow paces advancing down from the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of vast mountains were before me. The icy walls of the glacier overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered about, and the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves, or the fall of some vast fragment, the thunder sound of the avalanche, or the cracking reverberated along the mountains of the accumulated ice, which, through silent working of the immutable laws, was ever and anon rent and torn, as if it had been but a plaything in their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree also they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded for the last month. I retired to rest at night. My slumbers, as it were, waited on and ministered to my by the assemblance of grand shapes which I had contemplated during the day. They congregated around me. The unstained snowy mountain top, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods and ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds, they all gathered around me and bade me be at peace. Where had they fled when the next morning I awoke? All of soul inspiriting fled with sleep, and dark melancholy clouded every thought. The rain was pouring in torrents, and thick mists hid the summits of the mountains, so that I even saw not the faces of those mighty friends. Still I would penetrate their misty veil and seek them in their cloudy retreats. What were rain and storm to me? My meal was brought to the door, and I resolved to ascend the summit of Montanvert. I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It then filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul, and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind, and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I determined to go without a guide, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It is a scene terrifically desolate. In 1,000 spots the traces of winter avalanche may be perceived, where trees lie broken and strewed on the ground, some entirely destroyed, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of the mountains, or transversely upon other trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected by ravines of snow, down which stones continually roll from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are sombre, and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it, and curling in thick reefs around the opposite mountains. whose summits were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibility superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free, but now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. We rest, a dreamer's power to poison sleep. We rise, one wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for, be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may never be like his tomorrow, naught may endure but mutability. That, I suspect, is probably a quote from a published poem. It's a quote from Mutability, it would seem, by Percy Shelley, so Mary Shelley's husband. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks a sea of ice. A mist covered both that and the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the cloud, and I descended upon the glacier. The surface is very uneven, rising like the waves of a troubled sea, descending low and interspersed by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare perpendicular rock. From the sides where I now stood, Montevert was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc, in awful majesty. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed you wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me, as your companion, away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man, at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of a man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eye, and I felt a faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived as the shape came nearer. Sight tremendous and abhorred. Sight tremendous and abhorred. That it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could with the extinction of your miserable existence restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. Now then, must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you comply with my conditions, I will leave them, and you at peace, but if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death, until it is satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." Abhorred monster, fiend thou art! The tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes, wretched devil. You reproach me with your creation? Come on, then. What may I extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed? That I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm, I entreat you to hear me, before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough, that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an acclamation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, that which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Elsewhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Begone, I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, or let us try our strength in a fight, in which one must fall. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favourable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone? Miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do so as you do, and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is in your power to recompense me, and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed, by human laws, blood as they are, to speak in their own defence before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would with a satisfied conscience destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Yet ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call to my remembrance? I rejoined. Circumstances of which I shudder to reflect, that I have been the miserable origin and author. Cursed be the day, abhorred devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, be the hands that formed you. You have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone, relieve me from the sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still, thou canst listen to me, and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. Hold on, let me double check something. So he was trying to cover Frankenstein's eyes, because he asked him to relieve the sight of his detested form. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale, it is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself behind yon sunny precipices, and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story, and can decide, on you it rests, whether I quit forever the neighbourhood of man, and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of your fellow creatures, and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him, but as I proceeded I weighed the various arguments that he had used and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity and compassion. And compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of this opinion. For the first time also, I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. He crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold, and the rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits, but I consented to listen, and seated myself by the fire, which my odious companion had lighted. He thus began his tale. So, that concludes Frankenstein for this week. Let's move on to the riddles. I believe we concluded last week on riddle 106. Young ladies, now give ear, I pray, to one the most forlorn, for share my hapless fate you may, and grieve that you were born. Your lovely image I've displayed, possessed of life and breath. I'm flesh and blood, though always made by the rude hand of death. Now to conclude my mournful lay, of mortal fame I am, and feel the pangs of death I may, though some of us ne'er die. Ooh, what was the solution to that one now? Now I think on it. I've forgotten. I'm going to have to look it up again. A widow. That was it. So that was the solution to the last riddle we looked at last week. So now we will move on to a new riddle, or rather a riddle we've not encountered before. I cheer the righteous and the villain's sting, can teach a peasant or instruct a king. I make a bed of straw appear like down, and plant the thorns of terror in a crown. I sleep, start, wake or terrify, or sport in a city, village, cottage, camp or court. In darkness hid, I oft bring things to light, correct the bad and set the doubtful right. Though indivisible, to one place fixed, am split, divided, varied, twisted, mixed. Bestowing blessings or dispensing curses, I sometimes fill and sometimes empty purses. I hold unconquered governmental reigns, in Lapland snows and Libya's burning plains. Preside in Zambla 6 months, day and night, and rule in realms blessed with diurnal light. Whoever from me their due allegiance draw, defy terrestrial and celestial law, but those who hail me as their lawful queen, sail through love's voyage with a gale serene. Study to find me out, that done caress me, for happy they who quietly possess me. Could it be virtue? I cheer the righteous and the villain's sting, can teach a peasant or instruct a king. I make a bed of his straw appear like down, and plant the thorns of terror in a crown. I sleep, start, wake or terrify or sport, in city, village, cottage, camp or court. In darkness hide, I oft bring things to light. In darkness hid, I often bring things to light. The truth? Correct the bad and set the doubtful right. Though indivisible, to one place fixed, am split, divided, varied, twisted, mixed, bestowing blessings or dispensing curses, I sometimes fill and sometimes empty purses. I hold unconquered governmental reigns in Lapland snows and Libya's burning plains, preside in Zambla 6 months, day and night. Zembla. I can't find any reference to Zembla that conceivably could fit the poem. What about on Wiktionary? Nova Zembla? An archipelago in the Arctic Ocean in the north of Russia, administered by Arkhangelsk Oblast. That's probably Archangel. Preside in Zembla 6 months, day and night. Okay. Sunlight? And rule in realms blessed with diurnal light. Diurnal means like, well, diurnal usually refers to a creature that wakes during the day and sleeps during the night, doesn't it? Happening or occurring during daylight or primarily active during the daytime. Yes. However from me their due allegiance draw, defy terrestrial and celestial law. For those who hail me as their lawful queen, sail through life's voyage with a gale serene, study to find me out, that done caress me, for happy they who quietly possess me. I mean, preside in Zembla 6 months, day and night, that seems to narrow it down to something to do with daylight or the night. I cheer the righteous and the villain's sting. Can teach a peasant or instruct a king. I make a bed of straw appear like down. I plant the thorns of terror in a crown. I sleep, start, wake, or terrify, or sport in city, village, cottage, camp, or court. In darkness hid, I oft bring things to light. The sun? Correct the bad and set the doubtful right. Though indivisible, to one place fixed, am split, divided, varied, twisted, mixed. Light itself, which could be split with a prism. Though that contradicts indivisible, but they also say it can be split. Bestowing blessings or dispensing curses, I sometimes fill and sometimes empty purses. I hold unconquered governmental reigns in Lapland's snows and Libya's burning plains, preside in Zembla 6 months, day and night, and rule in realms blessed with diurnal light. However from me their due allegiance draw, defy terrestrial and celestial law. But those who hail me as their lawful queen, sail through life's voyage with a gale serene. Study to find me out, that done caress me, for happy they who quietly possess me. Moonlight, maybe? Because the goddess of the moon, Roman goddess I think, Selene, was female. Whereas I don't think the sun was a god, at least not in Greek mythology. The sun was pulled by the gods across the sky. But I think the sun was, to the extent that it had gender, seen as masculine. I think. Selene was the personification of the moon in Greek mythology. Is a goddess and the personification of the moon, also known as Mene. So it was Greek, not Roman. She's traditionally the daughter of the Titans Hyperion and Thea. And sister of the sun god, Helios. Okay. Oh yes, there was a Helios, wasn't there? Is a god and personification of the sun, solar deity. His name is also Latinized as Helios. Yes, I remember something about that. I think Helios was like in some Greek myths, the keeper of the sun or something. And who was it that charioted the sun across the sky? Was that Apollo? I might be wrong, I think that's right. And I think in some Greek myths he was seen as subservient to Apollo, I think. But he was male. Her Roman equivalent is Luna. Ah, that makes sense. I cheer the righteous and the villain's sting, can teach a peasant or instruct a king. I make a bed of straw appear like down, and plant the thorns of terror in a crown. I feel like that's a big clue that I'm not getting the reference. For. Or reference of. I sleep, start, wake or terrify or sport in city, village, cottage, camp or court. In darkness hid I, offering things to light, correct the bad and set the doubtful right. Though indivisible to one place fixed, and split, divided, varied, twisted, mixed, bestowing blessings or dispensing curses, I sometimes fill and sometimes empty purses. I held unconquered governmental reigns in Lapland's snows and Libya's burning plains. Preside in Zembla 6 months, day and night, and roll in realms blessed with diurnal light. However from me their due allegiance draw, defy terrestrial and celestial law, but those who hail me as their lawful queen, sail through life's voyage with a gale serene. Study to find me out, that done caress me, for happy they who quietly possess me. For the record, the Roman equivalent of Helios was Sol, it would appear, which I recognise as another name for the sun, so that makes sense. My best guess is sunlight, but I would not be at all surprised if I'm wrong. Conscience? Okay. I cheer the righteous, and the villain's sting can teach a peasant or instruct a king. I make a bed of straw appear like down, and plant the thorns of terror in a crown. I sleep, start, wake, or terrify, or sport, in city, village, cottage, camp, or court. In darkness hid, I oft bring things to light, correct the bad, and set the doubtful right. They're indivisible, to one place fixed, and split, divided, varied, twisted, mixed. Bestowing blessings or dispensing curses, I sometimes fill and sometimes empty purses. I hold unconquered governmental reigns in Lapland's snows and Libya's burning plains. I don't follow that reference. Preside in Zembla's 6 months day and night, and roll in the realms blessed with diurnal light. Again. That I don't see the connection. However, from me their due allegiance draw, defy terrestrial and celestial law. Don't follow. You'd have thought people who are ruled by conscience are in keeping with terrestrial and celestial law. Or am I misunderstanding what this is saying? But those who hail me as their lawful queen sail through life's voyage with a gale serene. Sturdy to find me out, that done caress me, for happy they who quietly possess me. In a way, I wish I got that. I do find some of that riddle confusing. Perhaps this is saying it the other way round. However, for me, their due allegiance draw. Perhaps that's saying try to make me their servant, perhaps. Not sure. 108. A couple, dear ladies, approach you with fear. In your presence, most humbly, they beg to appear. Such a pair, gentle fair ones, you seldom have seen, for since their formation at strife they have been. No man ever treated a poor woman so, no termagant ever caused a husband more woe. Oh, termagant, I'm sure we've looked that one up before. Termagant. A fictitious deity with a violent temperament who featured in medieval mystery plays represented as being worshipped by Muslims. Huh. A quarrelsome scolding woman, especially one who's old and shrewish. Obsolete. A boisterous, brawling, turbulent person, whether male or female. No termagant ever caused her husband more woe. Sometimes you would think he had slain her outright. Yet ere you're aware she is first in the fight, and wherever he advances to seize on his prey, as quickly she tears one half of it away. But all her endeavours are fruitless and vain, for in spite of her teeth he still gets them again. Though many their quarrels and frequent their strife, as soon as they're parted they're useless for life. Enough has been said, every woman be wise, and from such dissensions learn strife to despise. Dissensions, what was into dissent? Yes, an act of expressing dissent. A couple, dear ladies, approach you with fear. In your presence, most humbly, they beg to appear. Such a pair, gentle fair ones, you seldom have seen, for since their formation at strife they have been. No man ever treated a poor woman so, no termagant ever caused her husband more woe. Sometimes you would think he had slain her outright, yet ere you're aware she is first in the fight, and wherever he advances to seize on his prey, as quickly she tears one half of it away. But all her endeavours are fruitless and vain, for in spite of her teeth, he still gets them again. Though many their quarrels and frequent their strife, as soon as they are parted they're useless for life. Enough has been said, every woman be wise, and from such dissensions learn strife to despise. I mean, I wonder if this is a description of some mechanical process. Because it refers to... As quickly she tears one half of it away, but all her endeavours are fruitless and vain, for in spite of her teeth, he still gets them again. Teeth of a cog, perhaps? Could this be a description of something going round and round? I wonder what the last two lines are referring to. Enough has been said, every woman be wise, and from such dissensions none strife to despise. Similarly, a mortal and pestle, although they don't have teeth. I'm gonna have to look it up, aren't I? Scissors. Interesting. They are a pair, such a pair, gentle fair ones you seldom have seen, for since their formation a strife they have been. A man ever treated a woman so, no termagant ever caused her husband more woe. Sometimes you think he had slain her outright, yet ere ye are aware she is first in the fight. And whenever he advances to seize on his prey, as quickly she tears one half of it away. But all her endeavours are fruitless and vain, for in spite of her teeth he still gets them again. Though many their quarrels and frequent their strife, as soon as they're parted they're useless for life. Enough has been said, every woman be wise, and from such dissensions learn strife to despise. Oh, women should despise strife. From the tale of these two dissenting parts of a scissor. I see. Oh, well, it's a shame I didn't get that one. I feel like I was on the right lines. I'd concluded that it was probably something mechanical, but I didn't come to the right answer. Oh well. Thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stream. I will be streaming again on Friday with more Myst 4, and then again on Saturday and next Monday. once I finish Mist 4, I'll be moving on to Mist 5. I don't know when that will be, obviously. So, once again, thank you for coming and have a wonderful night. Good night.